Behavioural economics on a post-it 18, the availability heuristic. In economics and standard rational choice theory, just generally assume that people optimize or maximize. It's assumed that they'll maximize their expected utility or their subjective value of particular options that are placed before them, right? But in the 1950s, a very famous scholar, polymath called Herbert Simon, challenged that assumption by suggesting that people often don't optimize, but they satisfy. Essentially, that they choose things that are just about good enough, and then they move on to other things. Herbert Simon was another scholar who later won the Nobel Prize for economics, even though, strictly speaking, he also wasn't an economist. Now, I suppose embedded within that assumption of satisficing behaviour is the view that people adopt certain rules of thumb when they go about their daily decision-making activities and behaviours and choices. So you can imagine that, each of us makes many choices during the course of the day. And most of those choices we don't really think about too much. We just adopt almost like intrinsic, innate rules of thumb, and they are the heuristics. There's many, hundreds probably, of heuristics and rules of thumb that have been identified principally within the psychology literature. I'm just going to talk about, over the next few post-its, I'm just going to talk about some of the most sort of famous, I suppose, and original heuristics. A lot of these heuristics that are available today, that have been written about today, some of them are basically saying the same thing, but they're being given different labels. So I'm going to talk about a few sort of distinct rules of thumb, and these are ones that were identified also by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman again demonstrating the huge influence they've had on the development of behavioural economics and later the development of behavioural public policy. So the first one I'm going to talk about is called the availability heuristic. And essentially what the availability heuristic says is this thing at the top here, this little box. People assess the probability of an event by the ease with which similar instances can be brought to mind. So you can imagine that media stories can have a huge influence really on people's perceptions of what is likely to happen, that may not reflect very well the objective probability of those things happening. I should say that my view is that all of the heuristics, all of the behavioural economic phenomena that I'm talking about in these post-it notes, very probably evolved for good reasons, that helped us survive as a human race, as a species. Otherwise, why would we do them? You would imagine that they would have been evolved away by now if they were not good for us ultimately, right? But it might be the case that a lot of these phenomena, these heuristics, these rules of thumb, these aspects of our behaviours that have been labelled recently as biases, they may have been very important in our evolutionary development, but it might be that modern societies have developed at such a pace that sometimes these various heuristics lead us to do things that are not necessarily very sensible. Okay, so that's my view on these things, that they're not necessarily intrinsically biases or silly things to do. It's just that you can identify certain circumstances over which they did not evolve for, that lead people to make strange choices in those particular scenarios. So I'm just going to illustrate this with something that I just made up, and we'll see if it works. We'll see if it works for you here. I just thought, which of the following, if we were doing an example of availability, which of the following do you think kill people? This is for data from a couple of years ago. I think the following are most likely to. Which of the following kill the most people each year in the US, in the UK, England and Wales. So I put number 1, dog bites, accidental suffocation in bed. and accidental drowning in the bath. So all of them, I suppose, are relatively infrequent. The answer is actually number 3, accidental drowning in the bath. And yet I suspect that, and I'm just guessing here, I suspect that many people might have thought that dog bites were more common than drowning in the bath, because dog bites, when they do occur, they tend to attract very heavy media coverage. I'm not so sure that accidental drowning in the bath does, and I put the exact figures there for each of these causes of death the last time I checked. That might not be the greatest example of the availability heuristic, but I hope you get the sort of, the general idea for what this particular heuristic causes us to do. It might be a reason, for example, why people are particularly fearful of the possibility of dying in an aeroplane crash, even though dying in an aeroplane crash statistically is very unlikely, and dying in other forms of transport, particularly cars, is much more common. And the reason, possibly one of the reasons for that, despite the fact that people have probably a particular aversion to falling from the sky, is that aeroplane crashes, when they do happen, tend to be heavily reported in the media. So people might have the belief that because they're so heavily reported, that they're much more common than they actually statistically are. Ironically, it might be events that are relatively infrequent, such as that are most likely to attract media attention. And therefore, perhaps it's often the very unlikely events that really tend to stick in people's minds the most, so that they perceive them to be much more likely, and perhaps even more likely than statistically much more common events. Excuse me. So there we have it. The availability heuristic, behavioural economics, and I post-it number 18.